Thank you for your time today. If it's all right with you, I'd love to just share some of the things we've been thinking about and working on at our fund, trying to use analytics and data to get any kind of insights into startups that we might invest in. So we primarily invest in seed to Series A, mostly in healthcare diagnostics for the last few years. And I'd like to show you kind of how we go about doing that and how we're trying to change the way we look at markets. I think one of the unique things about our firm is about half of our team are technical people and data scientists, and we've spent a lot of money and a lot of time trying to develop analytics to use big data and other tools to get insights into early startups. I'll show you where some of that's taken us. And I think I want to start with some of the things we're wrestling with right now, because if you think of the challenge of trying to find the next Google, right, the next unicorn at the earliest possible stage, and especially trying to use data to do that when generally, it seems like there's no data about these companies. They're startups, they're small, they haven't done anything yet. So how can we do that better? And what's the size of the problem that we're trying to address? And let me show you what I mean by that. Oh, I'm CTO, not CEO of WRHambrecht. So I'm just the head nerd is all that is. But so normally, conventionally, when you look at a startup, there's a couple things most venture capitalists are looking for, right? They're looking for better products, a startup that has found out what customers want and it can deliver it much better than existing solutions, traditionally with better performance and lower costs, right? That's kind of the typical thing. And they're typically looking for chasing these hot growing markets. And some of the things we'll show and start to scratch the surface of today are how actually we found statistically both of these are fundamentally wrong. And if you consistently do the things up on the board, you're very unlikely to have a productive portfolio that returns well. So let's get into that a little bit and talk about why these things aren't actually the case and not what we should be looking for. And what should we be looking for instead, at least as far as data and statistics have to say. So first, I want to just orient to some of the challenges. I think we're all used to seeing the world because we're humans at the human scale. So when we think of markets, these are all telehealth companies. And these are these cool charts. Of course, we've seen all of us online where somebody takes the time to try to put all the different companies in a segment into a slide with the logos. And I think they're kind of neat. But when we think, imagine we could go back before COVID and you were thinking of launching a new telehealth platform, just as a case study. So it's a Zoom call with a doctor, basically, and build a company around that. If you were asked, okay, who are the other companies? Who are the competitors? Because by understanding the competitors, we can figure out gaps in the market and how to outcompete them. A lot of us would come up with a list something like this, where we have a few dozen companies, perhaps in different segments of the market, and we try to figure our strategy into a place that kind of fits where there's a bit of a white space. So thinking of the market at this level with a few dozen companies is what we'll call a human scale approach. And this is what most of us learn to do. And this is what we do on Google or by getting to know folks in the industry, or perhaps we're from the industry. And the challenge that we found at our firm as we began to use analytics to even ask very basic questions like who's in the market, right? That's all this chart is saying. If I want to invest or start a company in a space, who's out there so I can get a sense of the competitive landscape? We started building these big data tools to effectively do that, tell us who's in the market. And the problem is we started getting back image after image like this. So this is the actual telehealth market and before COVID, and there's roughly 11,000 companies globally doing telehealth or some version of it. So it's not a couple dozen, it's a lot more. So when you realize all these blue dots are companies, all the green dots are different segments of the telehealth market, you realize you have a whole nother problem because probably only a dozen of these companies are going to become great big unicorn market leaders someday. So now the challenge we had to realize is we're trying to pick up a dozen companies out of 11,000 companies. And suddenly, the way a traditional venture capitalist does this doesn't make sense. Because if this is how big the world is, I can have them pitch me, I can go to talk to accelerators and universities and startup events, I can get to know people, I can get on 50 different airplanes, or my team can, we can sort of have them pitch us, we can evaluate them side by side, we can decide which one or two we think are gonna win that are our size and get a deal done. At that scale, it makes sense. At this scale, it doesn't. The best we can hope to do is to meet some of them, maybe a dozen, and pick the ones we like the best, which is this sort of Brownian micro-random walk through this immense galaxy. So the odds that we're going to find that startup through that process is just not commensurate with the actual scale of the problem. And I wanted to lead with that because what we're finding is markets are much larger and more complex than we ever would have imagined. And at first, it was a nuisance. We were irritated, like, oh, that's too much data. You know, it's impractical. It's almost, why even do that? It's just too much. But then we started to sink in that, oh my gosh, no, whether we like it or not, this is the reality of the problem we have to solve. We have to find a dozen companies out of 11,000, and we can't possibly do that by meeting them one at a time. So that's a very hard thing to accept, but it is, and I'll show you a little more too. We'll play around. I mean, so just to give you a sense, this is an old one, right? So we have telehealth. Let's try to do it this way. You can see that. So we zoom in. The bigger dots, okay. So there's IBM. Okay, everyone from a huge competitor in this space. So if I'm launching a telehealth company that's a startup, and IBM is in this space, that's a really important thing to know, that my startup's going to have them as a competitor. So I can't invest in IBM. I guess I could buy their stock, but that's not the startup. All the way down to some of these startups that might be so small, they don't even have websites, but they're all in the market, essentially offering a Zoom call with a doctor. So they're almost identical. And I have to somehow figure out who the dozen or so of these are, hoping a few of them are my size at my stage where I can get a deal done and find the next Uber or Google or whatever equivalent is in this market. So this is kind of the scale that we're facing. And now, of course, post-COVID, there's probably twice as many or 3 times as many companies just in telehealth. So what we found we have to do is we have to lean into the problem. We can't just say, nope, I don't like the world that way. I'm going to pretend it's smaller because that's a lot more convenient. And I'm going to just go with the ones I like and feel chemistry with in the room. Or you can say, nope, like it or not, we're going to have to build a system and analytics and data to embrace the true size of how markets actually are and somehow make sense of it. Somehow figure out who's likely to win or lose at the earliest possible time, taking the full complexity into account. And so as you can imagine, that's just a daunting task and why we spent so much time. Because every time we sort of widen the aperture of what we can see in the market, we discover more companies and more complexity and more beauty than we ever thought. But then we realize our tools are inadequate and we have to keep going if we're ever going to solve this problem. So that's a tiptoe into kind of the challenge that we face. And we can't get into all of the answers and where we're stuck and where we're still struggling and where we're making progress. But I do want to share some of that. And specifically, some of the things that happen once you understand the markets at this scale. It's almost like physics. At a different scale, you start to find different properties, different physics emerge, if you will, at scale that fundamentally change the way you have to look at markets. And yes, as an investor, but even as an entrepreneur or an innovator yourself. First of all, if there's one company in a market, truly one company, which is almost never the case, but it's really up to that team to execute and have a good strategy and deliver. Now, as soon as you have 2 companies, it's who can do that better than the other. So skill is really, there's a premium on skill. When you get to 10 companies, skill still matters, but luck starts to intervene. Because one company just might be related to a company that's the founder has a cousin and it's the biggest client and they get a lead early and the rest is history. Once you get to 11,000, luck plays a bigger and bigger and bigger factor in terms of deciding who ultimately becomes those dozen market leaders. And it becomes less a function of the individuals or their individual effort. And that's a very challenging and daunting thing to take into account as well. So you get less able to inductively reason into, oh, this founder's pitched me. I like their story. I believe their theory of cause and effect, and I'm going to invest in it. At certain scales, that breaks down. And so you have to find other things you can lean on instead. And again, we're getting into a world of statistics and analytics here, where I want to find other indicators that give me more reliability, because I know that I could pick a company that has everything going for it, and it just luck never happens. Instead, it happens for their competitors. And I, as an investor, can't be wrong, or we'll lose money. So the second thing we're finding is, when I was in business school, we studied the dominant technology or dominant design a lot. And the idea was, if you can see which technology is going to win, then you kind of look at some of those companies and maybe you can pick out a winner. So if you're looking at CRISPR at once upon a time, maybe you can find there's a dozen companies doing that type of gene editing, and that helps you. Well, actually, what we found statistically is it's the opposite. It's not the technology that leads to the market leader. It's the market, it's the company that leads to the dominant technology. So let me give you an example. Back in the 80s, I don't think any of us would have, I mean, DOS, Microsoft was a crappy technology. We all, Control F7, we were all, everyone in this room, we all know what we're talking about. But Microsoft got that deal with IBM. We've all seen the movies or read the books, and then DOS became the de facto standard for PCs. And it wasn't because the technology was good, it's because the company commercially won. And now it just becomes the standard, and every piece of software has to write and code through DOS. And we think about Intel, the CPU, it was fine, but it wasn't the best technology at the time. There was printed circuit board logic and other technologies that were better, but the CPU won, Intel got that deal with IBM, and the rest is history. So now, for the next decades, everything had to go through DOS and the CPU. Why? Because those companies won commercially, and that ended up becoming the technological platform. What you'll find as you go back through your mental Rolodex is that's almost always the case. The best technology rarely wins, and if it does, it's typically quite random. It's usually that a company wins, and we all have to accept their technology as a downstream implication. So the technology is an effect, not the cause. And these are the kinds of things we start to understand as we start to look more globally at higher statistical volumes of what works and what doesn't, and sort of acclimate to a statistical world rather than one that's intuitively based on the cause and effect we all learned and have gotten used to. And I think every time we find one of these nuggets, there's a moment of complete and utter demoralization that I feel. Like, oh, crap, now what? Right? Like, if that's the way the world works, that's not how I've been thinking about it. Like, I don't even know what to do, but I know what I have been doing is wrong. And I almost have to just belly up to that and say, fine, I'm gonna look for an alternative, because I'm not gonna keep doing something that's wrong just because it's what I'm good at, right? So I find it torturous each time, but I think we just have to lean into these things and say, I don't care how it makes me feel. I've got to figure out my way through, and just knowing the problem sucks, but it's a start. Some more things too. We all know that companies are getting more interconnected, right? Through digitization, through supply chain, through globalization. At scale, interconnectivity actually has an effect where it's a causal mechanism for driving more extreme outcomes. So there was once a world, and there still is in some industries, we have market share, right? A pie chart, this company has 2%, this company has 5%. But as things get more interconnected in their business models, what you find is there are more extreme outcomes tend to happen, where winner takes all. And we're seeing this, right? We all remember I remember seeing the first unicorn list, right? Startups worth $1 billion, and there were 40 of them. And I remember thinking, oh my God, that is so many unicorns, right? And now, like, every day I get some new email about a new unicorn. I just delete it, I don't even read it. Like, there's just so many of them. But they're sucking up all the value, and you're getting this extreme outliers are driving more, like the black swan is driving more than the tail in terms of how the industry is shaping. And not only are we seeing more extreme outliers, and I think it's only going to get more extreme, because the more interconnected we get, the more extreme outliers we're going to find. So there's a causality here, and they're bigger. So we all know this, these valuations, even in a down round, are just bigger. The unicorns are bigger than ever. They're going up all the time. They're happening more often. They go up faster, and we're finding they also come down faster. So they have much shorter S-curves and half-lives. And it's very winner-take-all. Again, there's the idea of catching the 5th or 8th or 10th player and getting some share is almost gone in interconnected industries. Either you're on the top 1 or 2 players, or there's no point in even investing or playing at all. I mean, there's no point in being the 11th Google, because there's really Google, and that's it, right? So what's happening is it's getting more and more difficult to find the winners, because there's more companies, they're more interconnected, they're more dynamic. But the punishment for not getting the winner is getting more harsh all the time. There's less value being left on the table if you don't get the winner. And all this is just to say our problem's getting harder. It's more complex, it's more punishing when we're wrong, it's harder to be right. And we can't just inductively reason our way through. all this says is we're in this new world now. It doesn't feel good, but we're gonna have to go through it using different sets of tools. And that's why our firm has invested so much time and effort in trying to build tools, recognizing the scale of the problem. And I'm not saying we've fixed it all, but without the tools, we're just meeting people and betting on who we like, which I hope at this point just seems insane. Might as well throw a dart. Well, let's start talking about some of the things we have seen. And this is pretty basic, right? We're not gonna get into data science. There'll be no code, so rest at ease. But even just some observational statistics can be a powerful thing. And so maybe to give us a little bit of hope. This chart represents some of the early findings we had that were really foundational. And it's based on thousands of observations of different startups over decades. And what we found is, obviously, if there's an innovation and you're already an incumbent, so let's say Coca-Cola comes out with some new bubbly water that tastes good, I don't know. If an incumbent comes out with a better performance product, about 2/3 of them survive 10 years as a product line, and they tend to grow in a way that's highly correlated with their market segment. So that, we all knew that. But here's where I think it gets interesting. If Coca-Cola or you or I or anyone is a new entrant in a market, and we have a better performing product, so we find out what customers want, we deliver it better, we start a business, you can see the survivorship crashes down to 13%, which is really bad. In fact, if you just look at, in the US anyway, government data on new businesses, roughly 35% of them survive 10 years. So this is less than half of the survivorship of just new businesses, so to speak. And statistically, it's anomalous. We shouldn't have this much failure in a category. So something's going on here. There's a causality. Why are better products systematically underperforming? And I think it's an interesting, the first slide I showed you showed that better performance was one of the things we've all learned to do. And now I'm saying statistics are telling us, nope, don't ever do that. And we want to know why, and what can we do instead? Well, the why, the causality, we believe, is it's a competitive response. So if you really are a startup, you're new in a market, and you actually are better, you've actually put your competitors who were there before you into a box. In game theory, you've narrowed their options, because if they don't do anything, you're better. You'll start to take their customers away. So they have to eventually respond. And they have very limited vocabulary that they can respond with. Essentially, they have to acquire you or kill you, because if they don't, you'll take their customers. So what we find is, the short version is, it's just a lot easier for incumbents to defend a castle than for you to invade it. That's it. But over 85% of the businesses we see are this: better performance, new entrants. It is the overwhelming dominant strategy. And it's what we all learned. It's what I learned. And why? Because we generally study case studies of innovation using big companies as the model. IBM comes out with a better whatever, or 3M comes up with a better whatever. So we're studying incumbents who succeeded with a better performing product. And we haven't figured out that when you're a new entrant, when you're not a castle, it's a completely different set of math. So all the behaviors we learn in one context don't work in another circumstance, and nobody's told us that we've changed. So what do you do? And I think you can see there's some other strategies with much higher survivorship odds. A low end is your Clayton Christensen disruptive innovation. You know, you come up from the bottom, start cheaper and worse, and just kind of work your way up, like a Walmart or a Southwest Airlines or a McDonald's. You know, you just kind of come up from the bottom. And that certainly happens. Another one is the market creating strategy, which takes a lot of nuance to describe, but the short version, it's like a blue ocean. You go into a market where there's truly no competitors. It's just you. You're solving a problem the customer has, and it's just you. So there's no one to respond. There's no incumbent. There's no competitor. And again, we can be very specific about that. But in that case, if you're coming down, if you go head to head with the incumbents, your odds are low. If you start in the bottom of the market that they just don't care about, with customers they don't really want to fight for, your odds go up. Or if you start off in some market they just truly don't care about, never takes a customer from them, your odds go up a lot. And what we see is not only do your survivorship odds go up as a startup, by the way, or a brand new business, but the compound annual growth rate averages a little over 70% across industries over so it's quite high. So just knowing a few basic details about a company's go-to-market strategy has a huge impact potentially on their odds. And as a venture capitalist, I just can't ever say yes. So if all you ever do for the rest of your life, we've got a lot of ROI in our time together. If anytime someone's showing you they've got a new business and it's better than everybody else and they can prove it, just say no, right? And if that's all you do, you'll probably triple your accuracy for the rest of your life. So we've accomplished a lot here today with just that. Now, a lot of times those are easy to spot. It's these low-end or market-creating ones that are harder. They're like maybes. In other words, you hear some details, you think, oh, it might be one of those, and that's where you want to know more and dig in. So I think this chart just tells me what's an easy no, or a maybe I should keep thinking and talking about this, and it helps me triage my time. And potentially, you can imagine with something like this, you can code it and teach a computer to look for it and help you process all those companies to find those ones that really do fit your thesis with higher odds. And it doesn't require 1,000 meetings if you can do it through data. And those are the kinds of things that we do. Okay, we talked about the low end. You just come up from the bottom like Volkswagen, cheaper and worse, get better over time. And we talked a little bit about this blue ocean or this market creating strategy with higher odds, where effectively, if these are the customers and their purchasing power is the x-axis, there's some customers, let's say today in that rectangle, those are the customers in a market. Just don't go into the existing market and fight for share. That's what we're saying. Never fight for share if you're a new entrant. Instead, who are all these non-customers not in the market today because they don't have the money, skill, or access to solutions? And can you find them? Because they're not on any market research report. They don't exist. But can you find people with problems, B2B or B2C, break down those barriers and let them in for the first time? And that's when your odds go up quite a bit. Let me pause for a second. That was a lot of ground. And I know some people are online, so I'll try to repeat. But does anyone have any questions? We pause for a second. Patents. Yeah, how much do we think about patents? How does that fit into our equation? What we found is, so we care qualitatively about patents. I mean, patents are a good thing, especially if they're defensive. So we know the startup probably won't get sued for doing what it's going to do. But beyond that, statistically, we actually don't find that patents or lack thereof affect the variance and outcomes. So statistically, it's just a non-issue. Sorry if you're a patent lawyer. They're good to have. They just don't predict anything. Lots of dead companies had great patents.
Hi, you mentioned that new technologies don't always win. Now, isn't that though more on a micro scale? Because I mean, certainly CDs replaced cassette tapes and DVDs replaced VHS tapes. Now, VHS wasn't the better technology, but it did win. Great there. But when it does come to truly new technologies, don't they always or mostly win?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I would just take any technology and immediately bifurcate it based on its strategy. So it really matters who you are and what your strategy is. So when Sony had Betamax, that might be a little more of the incumbent, if you will. And VHS came along and it was just worse, but it was cheap, right? And it was sort of cheaper and worse. So that means the new entrants coming in with VHS technology were down here. And then the Sony with Betamax was up at the top. But so I would put it this way, note that we don't look at the technology as much as the strategy that the people use to take it to market. And are they going in head to head, or are they going into some niche, or are they going into the bottom? So we bet on specific businesses and their strategy. In a way, we're not betting on the technology. It's more of a detail, which is surprising. I mean, that's a way to look at it, I guess. Questions? Question?
Right.
Oh, that's a microphone.
Isn't the question that just came from the floor related to the next slide that you had on, where the consumers already existed, they were purchasing music, and what was developed was a better platform that made music more accessible and less expensive, et cetera, et cetera. So the question actually proves your graph.
Yeah, let me run with that a little bit, if it's okay. If we shift a bit, well, we could use, I think the VHS is almost a combination, but yeah, VHS, remember back in the day, we were going to movie theaters, or you had the home reel, which not a lot of people had. And but yeah, all these people, us, would love to watch a movie at home. We just couldn't. And somebody had to make it cheap and easy, and I just plug in a thing and just did it. And I think that's where VHS came in. So all of a sudden, this huge group of non-consumers were us, who could now just watch a movie at home instead of having to go in and pay somebody else to show us one in a theater. Yeah. So what we've shown you is a bit of the tip of the iceberg, but I just want to show you how we're trying to attack these challenges of trying to find the next unicorns and market leaders sort of at scale, or through statistics, or through different means other than the traditional pitch. Now, if we find a startup, I'll generally reach out to them if we can see that they're winning, their analytics all look good. We're still going to do, say, a month of due diligence. So it's not as if we just fund everything that goes beep on our computer. But I think the point is we're not going to fund things where our analytics give us an insight that it's not a good bet. And we're going to look more intensely at things that show that something really is. And this is just an example too. I mean, today we can look at markets at scale through all their different subsegments, however we want to define them. All of these this is gut microbiome. All of these are segments of that market. All the dots are companies. We can estimate the valuation of startups, even small private startups. Even if we have no financial data about them at all, we can use big data to estimate their valuation. That was quite a trick, but we can look at a little early stage company and know what it ought to be worth. And we can track their valuation over time using big data. So without knowing the company's sales, without caring about their fundraising, I can look across markets, see which companies, how much value each company's created, see which ones are in my sweet spot, and estimate their change in value and their growth over time. So I can actually find companies my size that are growing faster than any of their competitors, and we can reach out to them and then begin the conversation there. I can look across markets, see who's growing, declining. I can look at segments of markets to do the same. I can do it all in real time. And so the point is, and we can zoom in and we can zoom out and see different insights along the way based on the data we're able to collect and the patterns that we're able to match. So this is mostly just meant as a picture, but I really think this is us trying, and it's not always perfect, but to try to address the problem with tools at the same scale. Because we're not going to be able to do it the traditional way without just basically hoping and getting lucky. And we have to find another approach. And this has been working. And we found that as we've been doing this, it started small, we continue to build, but now, the performance of our fund is just through the roof. We almost never have companies fail anymore. We have a very high percentage of unicorns and pre-unicorns. So we're seeing this directly in our ROI. It's really working, which is encouraging. It just gets us more engaged and to do even more of this. But that's the path. And I think not everyone has the luxury of spending a decade and a half building analytics and all of this. So that's not really the point. I just think the point is to say, hey, we're building this telescope of sorts. And instead of looking at the stars, we're trying to look at markets. And our telescope isn't optical, it's data. And we're trying to see what's out there. And every time we widen the aperture of our lens, we're seeing more companies, more stars. And it's totally changing the way, if we accept what we're seeing, the way we think about it. And it really does feel like science. And a lot of times we think, oh my gosh, the problem's even more daunting and I don't know what to do and I'm going to feel terrible for a few months. But accepting that like a scientist and trying to figure out how do we begin to grapple with the true scope of things, it does feel exciting and it does feel like we're building a telescope. And you start to recognize that all these dots aren't just dots, they're companies, there's people. They're trying to change some part of the world that they're passionate about. And I wish they could all win. But sort of every time we widen the aperture, we see more stars and it gives us a little encouragement along the way and makes us feel like we're getting somewhere. And certainly moving ahead of where we used to be, which is just doing our best to meet people and decide who we liked from scratch. So that's what I really wanted to share. Again, this is, I think, the last slide, but happy to take questions as well. But now I hope this makes more sense. And I at a minimum, I hope, say, just if you're a startup, if you're a new entrant, don't have a better product, right? Just don't. And this idea of chasing big, hot markets, we're not finding that that actually is a good idea either. What we're finding is in any market, whether it's hot or not, there's a very small number of companies that are just outperforming everybody else. And it's about finding those stars, those companies that are doing incredibly well. It's not about the segment that they're in. So for example, Uber, I mean, the taxi industry, if we go back, was not a hotbed. It wasn't crypto, like it was just kind of the taxi industry. I mean, just hadn't changed since buggies, right? But there were some companies that were absolute rocket fuel doing really well. So if you looked at the industry, you would have walked away. It's not about the industry, it's about who's disrupting. Same in Airbnb. The hotel industry was not a hot, sexy place to invest, but there were a couple companies doing incredible things. So it's not about chasing hot markets. It's not about following the bandwagon. It's about being able to identify those very specific needles in a haystack if and when they start to take off and cherry picking them into a portfolio. So that's a very different problem and we need very different tools. Okay, I don't know if I'm out of time, but that's what I plan to share. Linda, or what's next?
Thomas, it's
Okay.
much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
We're going to have a little more of a chance to ask questions later, but as Thomas said, he is the Chief Nerd Officer and very academic. I mean, using scientific method over the last 15 years to collect data so that we can actually have those insights. Quite literally, those percentages or statistics haven't changed much over the 15 years, isn't it, Thomas? Basically stayed the same. But, you know, how can we learn from the research? We're not venture capital. We're the ones in the galaxy, the stars that need to be found by venture capital firms like WRHambrecht Co. So how do we as businesses use the research, apply those findings that Thomas spoke about to actually have winning products? How can we fail less than what we are now? How can we win more than what we have in innovation? And it is a very methodical, different approach. I've had 20 years experience working in ASX companies actually helping launch ideas. And we were so busy, we just went from one idea to the next and kicked the last thing that didn't work underneath the carpet. We didn't have someone who picked up and analysed everything to go, what happened, what went wrong? When I look at it now, I see we didn't actually have the science. We used our intuition always. It's probably taken me a long time to be able to change my thinking in the way that Thomas has just presented. So what we're going to have now is how can we apply or get evidence so you can see how we're applying this. Up until now, the Fortune 500 companies that are collaboration partners with Growth Science, which manages the research ongoing, has only been accessible to those companies and obviously to WRHambrecht Co. And we've been here in Australia actually been fortunate enough to get the tools and being able to apply the science to everyday businesses. So mid-tier corporates, even startups can learn about how can they be that shining star using a very methodical approach in their strategy setting, which Thomas spoke about. So what I'd like to do is to invite Thomas back to participate in the panel. Trevor Holmes from Avivo ICP and Mark Portbury, who we're going to, now Mark is actually launching a product. They had an idea, we'll tell you a little bit of background, and then how was the actual science and approach that we've heard Thomas talk about be applied to that idea. So we're hoping this is like bringing the application of the science in a real day version of looking at an idea and launching it. So I thought maybe, Trevor, we'll start with you. Trevor, you're in a different order than I expected.
Yeah, right. Doesn't matter.
So when Thomas shows the statistics, you're one person that gets excited about the statistics when probably innovators out here are going, oh my God, maybe I shouldn't even bother. But you get excited. Why is that?
Yeah. I think it's as simple as we all know that knowledge is power. And, you know, when we have that particular knowledge, then there's ways that we can map those sort of market entry strategies and so on. But the confidence, particularly when it's backed by the scientific rigor that's been applied in this situation, means that we can have and build a lot of confidence both for our clients and ourselves when we're developing those market entry strategies. And that just makes the job of having that confidence to succeed and change that meter so that we are having a lot less failures. So, yeah.
And Thomas, you've been working with these big corporates for like 15 years in the collaboration process, well, not you personally, but the growth science team. And you mentioned that, you know, what we've found is that it is counterintuitive. Is change happening within those corporates you've been working with so they don't just go straight to their gut now? You know, 15 years is a long time. Are they actually changing, adapting to be using the science more?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, we've done a few collaborations with corporates, mostly because they're a market leader in a domain where our fund wants to learn more. So we say, all right, you can use some of our tools to look at all your deals, but we want to spend time with you and your scientists and your people to understand your market. So we've done some of these limited research partnerships. And I do think it's interesting to see, on the one hand, the C-suite tends to be very quick to see what you just saw and say, oh, yep, absolutely, let's change how we look at deals, let's change the criteria. So intellectually, I find that that's easy. In practice, it's almost impossible because trying to convince their teams and all the socialization and all the lateral, and I mean, it just, and you, even an enlightened CEO who's seen this and gets it, has a real hard time getting their people to do those deals. And I think the companies, they tend to come from a very scientific background, and they bring their domain expertise to the table. And so they tend to obsess over the technology, and they tend to obsess over whether they want to acquire the startup after they invest. So they ask themselves the question, is it the right technology? And if we invest in this company in venture capital, are we going to buy them someday? And I actually think those are just absolutely the wrong questions to ask. First of all, the technology is not the point, right? It's, if the company's winning, it doesn't matter if their technology sucks. You got to live with it, like invest anyway. Second of all, I don't think you should ever do venture capital in a company you're going to buy someday. Because if you wanted to acquire them, why put capital at risk? Just buy them now. Or if you want to de-risk it, just do a commercial agreement, work with them, be their customer, and buy them in 2 years. Like, why put capital at risk? And now you have a fiduciary conflict, heaven forbid you're on their board, like you've just made it harder to buy them. So if you want to buy them, don't do venture capital, which is very odd to hear a venture capitalist say. But I use it to make a point though, that the conventional wisdom, right, is almost always wrong once you have some of what we all now have in this room, right, in your heads. And the level of socialization that companies have to go through is just, as you know, immense. To do a $2 million venture deal could take them 9 months of internal debate and by then, if your process takes more than a couple weeks, which only the crappy startups wait, right? The good ones aren't gonna wait 3 months while you make up your mind. They don't need you, they're growing like crazy, they've got plenty of capital, they're gone. So if your process takes a long time, it's almost like a sieve that only catches crappy companies. You know, the ones that they'll wait, the bad ones will wait forever because they got nowhere to go. Like, yeah, sure, take your time, just please give us money. So I do find that getting people to understand this conceptually is easy, relatively easy. Putting it in practice, especially for corporates, it can happen, but my God, it's so hard. And I think I don't have the answer to that, but it's just painful to watch because every time it's exactly the same. And I've even had CEOs talk to us about, hey, can we do some of their deals for them? And I think, well, you're the CEO, can't you? And they're like, no, you don't understand. I can't even do the deals I want to do because my people won't do them. I'm like, you're the boss. And they're like, yeah, that's not how it really works, you know? So it's tougher it's more than just understanding. I think there's real problems and challenges in turning it to operationalize it.
Corporates are looking at not just looking at investing in startups, they're also looking at the investments in new products, for example, as well. So the data set that that is behind the MESE computing system is both startups and new products?
Yeah, we do the same thing for a new product instead of a startup, and it's the same thing, right? I think even when the project team, first of all, who's closest to the market and understands the value proposition, has spoken to the, like even when they have it exactly right, the socialization required to get buy-in from everybody, it's just so painful. And I think they might get funding, but every quarter, every year, their head goes back on the block. And to keep funded, even when you have a really disruptive business, is so hard in corporates. It's not impossible, but it's hard. Yeah.
Now, Mark, Hero is a spin-out idea that you've got from an existing business. So how did that idea come about, and how has the business, set about to progress that idea? Just a bit of background.
Yeah, so we started our journey with Hero. Well, technically it was about 2 years ago, but really it's a story that goes way back 13 odd years. I started writing the software to solve the job of the firm that I worked for at the time, which was a professional consultancy practice. I saw what was out in the market and I thought it was all rubbish, and I thought, no, I can do a better job than that, which is exactly what you're not meant to do. But the journey was never meant to be about building a commercial product. And we got, about 2 years ago, we just kept hearing this story from the folks that work for us that, they'd never seen anything like this before, that never had such an easy experience using a product like it before. We thought, well, maybe there's something in this. Maybe this story that we're getting, there's a potential that others could enjoy it as well. But we were a professional consultancy practice that had zero idea how to sell software. It's such a completely different market. So, we knew that we were going to need help of working out not only does this product have a life commercially, is there even a need for it in the marketplace? Is it just an awesome product that we like using, or is it something that others might actually find some usefulness of it? So we started the road of looking at the data science and exploring how do we validate whether this thing that I've built, is it just a cool thing for us, or has it actually got something that we can turn into a commercial product?
So 13 years ago, you started developing it. Then a couple of years ago, you went, could this have an opportunity given the feedback that you had? What was your gut? What was the business or gut feeling about how you might have gone to market at that stage before you met, say, at Vivo?
Yeah, we were about 100 employees at the time, and we thought our audience in our organisation love it because of how comprehensive the product was. It had all the feature tick boxes. So our original idea was, well, we need to go and look at customers like us. We need to look at whether that's a broad multidisciplinary practice with a lot of moving parts, or whether it's at the same scale as what we had. But the data science told us something quite different. We needed focus. We needed to make sure that the segment that we went after was quite narrow and defined. So we ended up focusing specifically on town planners and surveyors as our core market entry strategy. But the really big thing for us was that we decided we wanted to decrease our scope of who we wanted to go after. So we're targeting 5 to 20 employees who currently aren't even in the ecosystem for wanting to manage their business with a tool like ours. They're in the chaos of Excel spreadsheets and it's just madness for them. And they're like, please, we just need some control of our organization. We're just, I'm doing really well in my business, but I'm not doing well at running my business and I need some help. So we ended up deciding to target that 5 to 20 segment. And we also thought, based on the feedback that we got and the learnings through the data science, that it's actually advantageous that we need to turn off some of those features that we've got, because what we had, it did everything. And if you put it on a features list, it was going to fill a page. But that's very overwhelming for a small business person where they're just trying to work out, how do I make sure that my costs are managed for my business and I'm getting my invoices out at the end of the month? So we focused the feature set of the product solving the job that they were asking needed to be done, and selling a story of that we're here to give you freedom to go and do the things that you love doing. And it allowed us to then sell a story that was something that they could buy into, rather than just getting overwhelmed with this huge thing that was competing with all these other huge products that are out there that are doing the same thing.
It must have been hard as the product developer to turn off the features, huh?
Yeah, I had to cripple my baby. It was pretty hard. It's been really interesting. I was skeptical, to be honest, of whether that, but we have so much stuff. Why do we want to turn it off? But what we're learning with our early adopter program that we're in at the moment is that is working. People like the focus that we have. And it also means that once they get into the product and realize that they really like what the core feature set is, they're more inclined to then have a conversation about, well, could we also do some of these other things as well? If they're already part of the ecosystem and love it, then there's an opportunity for adding a bit more, and we can turn those things back on for them.
You were going to say, Thomas?
Better performance.
Yep.
And then decided instead of better performance, you focused on a smaller segment, didn't have solutions, and you made it more simple.
Yeah, we artificially hobbled the
Sounds
product.
good.
And yeah, it was hard. Doing that the first day that I spun it up, and I saw everything turned off, but I'm like, no, this is where we're headed, and this is what the market wants.
Yeah, it's interesting. Engineers in particular have such a hard time defeaturing a product. I mean, it's just painful. and especially when you tell them, no, it's a higher odds strategy. And they're like, yeah, well, it seems stupid, but I'm good on you for having the discipline, and I'm glad it's working.
Trevor, what was the process? So just, give us a sense of how you met Mark and what was sort of the situation at the time, and then how did that get guided that you could build confidence in doing something counterintuitive to what they might have wanted to originally do?
It was really awesome, actually. I think I saw Peter just walk in just before, and Peter had referred us to Saunders Havel, and they actually had 3 technologies, and would we please come along and sort of assess each of them. And yeah, when I went in, there was 2 that we didn't feel that there were market, there wasn't a market there for. And then this particular one that Mark, that has now become Hero, was one where my intuition was, oh, there's so many of them in the marketplace, that's really not based on what we've learned a place to go. But we started with Opportunity Mine. And that is a process where we're able to understand the wants, needs, what companies the marketplace values and what they care about. And it's statistically ranking of how much each of those essentially jobs that need to be done by the market, how much influence that has over the market, which is unbelievable when we can actually look at these sort of things and go, you know what? Here's what the competitors are winning at. But in Mark's situation, it was very clear that there was quite a number of gaps that the market, particularly this non-consumption end, the lower end of the market, was not being satisfied with, because their alternatives were either too expensive, too complex, too overwhelming. And so with that information, the quantitative side of things, we started talking to that particular market segment. And lo and behold, we found not only the functional jobs that they needed done, but also the emotional jobs. And that's helped inform Mark with his product development for the go-to ready market phase. But also it's informed the marketing team as to what messages need to be, front and center. And it's really sort of panning out that way.
The competition the value chain presented with you?
Yes, it was certainly in the 40s to 50s.
Yeah.
And, it would be wonderful if we could apply every single one of those to the market. but we do believe in lean startup methodology and going to market with a minimum viable product. And that's where we had those discussions with Mark. I said, mate, we want you to turn off this one and this one and this one, and only go with these. And yeah, certainly through the early adopter program, we're getting very strong feedback from those participating that, wow, this is the job I wanted to do and this is great. And it's so, Mark's done a wonderful job in designing something that is very intuitive for the user, and his UX and his user experience has always been customer centric, and that is playing out with the feedback that we're getting from those early adopters.
I might actually open it up to the floor if you've got some questions to ask, either Thomas or Mark or Trevor, around just what we're talking about now. Okay, some more thinking time. Oh, there we go.
So how do we, what do we do when we see in an existing market, and like how do we think of a startup in context? I even need to go back to the chart and the things we discussed, right? I really care about how that startup is, what their first beachhead is, like what's their first market, and I don't think their first market has to be their last. So what I want to know is, are you lower cost, or cheaper and worse than everything else and going for the bottom of the market, which sometimes they are? Or are they picking a subsegment of users or customers that just, again, truly have no solution? They're just being ignored, they have nothing. So there could be 1,000 different vendors, but there's some segment that none of those 1,000 are talking to or even care about at all. And the way I like to think about it is, if you attack a fortified castle with incumbents and competitors as a startup, I just think your odds are terrible. So instead of attacking a fortified hill, try to find a little island with no inhabitants at all, and you can just walk up and plant your flag and you're king immediately, because there's nobody to say any different. And so find a beachhead, and at first it's going to look small, it's not going to look interesting. Investors might say, oh, well, that's a tiny market, it's a niche. But then find another adjacent beachhead and keep finding these beachheads. And if you get enough islands, you end up with Indonesia, right? And then you can start to have more frontal assaults on larger properties. But really, this island hopping is exactly how we like startups. And well, we don't care about the initial market. And I think that's where a lot of VCs get it wrong. They say, oh, show me a big, fast growing TAM, big market. And we actually say, no, show me the opposite. You might end up eventually moving up it through a roadmap to the big, juicy market. But I want you to start way off in the periphery, that nobody's going to pay attention until you're big enough to withstand the pressure once you start to compete.
Thomas, a similar question along. You've got these tools that let you look at a market and see how complex that market is in some sense. But when you do that, do you then use that to decide, I'm going to ignore that market? For example, telehealth. It's got 11,000 players in your graph in it. Do you go look and see, can I find a market with only 2,000 players?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some of that, but some things our analytics let us do is take those 11,000 telehealth companies and actually estimate the valuation and growth of each of those, even if they're private. And what I want to look at, out of that 11,000, are there any kind of Series A size, my size companies that are growing faster than everybody else? And I really want to say, is there this hyper growth company in there? And our analytics let us do that. And so I'll take those 11,000 and do some more analytics to let me cherry pick the 5 or 6 companies that are winning. And those are the ones I'll contact and then begin a process to see who I'll invest in. So all our deal flow is outbound. In other words, I'll look at the market, crunch it all down to those companies that are winning, and I send them just a cold email. And surprisingly, they get back to me, and then we do a deal. I mean, I'd say maybe 20% don't get back to me. They probably think it's spam, but I'll just keep at it for a while. But the idea that inbound deal flow, that someone's going to come in just by knowing a friend of a friend and pitch me, the odds that that person is one of the 15 out of 11,000 that's going to, are so small that it's almost a time waste. So yeah, but a consequence has been all our deal flow is really outbound now, which is just strange. We're a venture capital firm that doesn't do pitches.
As you're actually still trying to find the needle or the winners within that huge.
Yeah. So the market doesn't matter to me so much as the company. Yeah.
Hi, I've got two questions. Thomas, I'm interested in, if you're not gathering financial data, if you're a startup or a small scale up, what are the data breadcrumbs that we can be leaking out into the ecosystem that might come onto your radar? And the second question is to Trevor and Mark. I'm interested to understand what that journey has been around attracting the funding when you focused on a small segment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't want to can't give away all of the things we listen to because it'd be too easy to game for startups, right? But I'll say this, you know, if we could get financial data, we would use it. It's just all these seed early stage startups don't have revenue or they don't disclose anything. So we have to make do without it until we start talking to them. So the way I would put it is, if we use a metaphor of the pond and a pebble and you throw a pebble in the pond. So if the startup is the pebble, I'm not measuring the pebble. In other words, I'm not gathering data about the startup or their press releases or what they're doing so much. What we're doing effectively is we're measuring the ripples in the market around them. And we're kind of backing into their valuation based on, so we're gathering data about the market, its reaction to them, not them. So it's harder for them to game. And this is not going to sound very helpful, but if they're just really getting a lot of interest and traction in companies and customers, like people, like it's going to show up better. And our indicators are so broad that that we want to hear it first. But it's actually, I don't want to digress too much. We don't actually listen to social media. So that surprises people because again, it's too easy to game. It's too fickle. You can affect it with an influencer for 3 months, but we have to look at much deeper kind of metadata that we found much more reliable. So it's hard to specify, and in order to game it, you'd actually have to have an incredible amount of traction. So might as well just get the traction and we'll find you. Yeah, sorry, there was another question.
Yeah.
I'd say the great segue to your second question is about the process and how, I guess.
So very important to follow. What we've developed is the launch formula. You can take a look at it on our website, but there really are steps to validate along the path. And we start off with conceptualization. Even before investing in the data science tools that, you know, is provided through Linda from Thomas, we want to get an idea about the strategy and the opportunity, and is there even conceptually, what does this commercialization process look like? And, you know, roughly speaking, how much is that going to cost and how big is the market and what could be possible? That's, if we can validate at that point, then we can invest in the data science tools and go to the next level and get much more sophisticated. But I think in Mark's case, you know, it was a situation where Mark is supported by a number of directors in the organisation. I might hand you over as to what we needed to do to convince them to actually put some dollars on the table.
Yeah, it wasn't an easy sell. That we're in a professional consulting firm, and how would you like to be a startup software business? So yeah, there was certainly some a little bit of information was required to help with securing their support. You know, we now have. You know, they are now wholeheartedly supporting my business partners and I in going through the process, and it really is the data that gave us the confidence to be able to take that next step. It's not just been a one-time thing. We've been working with Trevor and Linda for 2 years now, and throughout that process, there's been multiple points where we've had to essentially ask ourselves, is this go or no go? Which has been, I guess, particularly hard for me, given that it was my baby. But, you know, I need to make sure that this thing can stand up to scrutiny from investors who are rightfully going to ask, well, what's my probability of return? Because as we've discovered, launching a software business is also not cheap. But it's through that validation of understanding who is the market segment that we need to target, what are the characteristics of that market, what is the specific composition of the industry segment that we want to go after, and what is the core narrative that we want to pitch to these potential customers. It's certainly not going to be a story of we can do timesheets and we can do invoicing, because that's really boring. And the market doesn't want to know that. And the data science has really helped us tune what those messages are. People in small businesses, they don't really care about whether your product can do invoicing or not, but they do care about having the tools available at their fingertips in an easy way that means that they can have a sense of control and order of their business, and that they feel like they don't have to lay awake at night. It's those emotional parts of the narrative that just, for us, was so important. And it's putting all of those things together that we went through this process over the last few years and constantly tested. Are the feedbacks that we're getting from the market, from the science, from the information that we're gathering, is it according with what a strategy is that we're comfortable with? And ultimately, we're still at this point that we're very keen to continue and continue to build Hero, having that confidence behind us that it does just give us that ability to know that if we need to continue to fund this thing forward, there's a higher probability that that's actually going to return back to us.
I think probably the other thing to take on board is, and Mark and his team have been, ideal clients in that from the conceptual phase, they wanted a business case. And that's where the data science tools were enabled us to build that business case with qualitative research, actually talking to the customers and understanding what the greatest jobs they needed done, but also, how satisfied were they with how they were able to do those now. And all that information then leads to validation, which came the funding, but we're not finished yet. There's another 5 validation points for us to go through, but to Mark's credit and his team, we're sticking very much on that pathway and making sure that the expenditure is aligned to the next validation point. But the great thing about the launch formula is the inverse relationship. As you're moving up along the pathway into the market and getting those validation, risk is actually declining. And that's a really valuable thing for companies that we work with to know, and only investing those elements to go to the next stage.
Sort of closing on the time, but I guess now just from 3 of you, what would be, I guess, some advice or from experience that you would give innovators out there that might be startups, they might have their own business like you were involved in and they're wanting to launch an idea? What would be some key points that you could tell them?
For me, a big one that I've learned is don't get blinded by the vision. I spent 12 years hand slaving my code and building it to what I thought was this big, wonderful, beautiful thing. But I've had to get really comfortable with saying, no, we're not taking that forward, or no, that's not within the vision of what a successful business strategy is going to be. And I've needed those inputs to help me understand that. So it's not to say that you shouldn't try and build a great experience for a customer, but it's about making sure that it's really tailored and specific to a really thought out market segment, that you've got a really good understanding that you've got a decent chance of succeeding in that. So yeah, I guess don't be afraid to slice and dice on your baby before you then try and take it forward into a commercial product.
Excellent advice. Trevor?
I think I support that with Mark in that, you know, a lot of people know that there's a process to this, but really being, you know, focused on this launch formula and following it through and getting market validation along the way. The data science tools that the MESE computing system has provided us is like having a spotlight shone down the road so that we've got clarity around which market segments to enter into, why, whether they're, you know, low end or latent demand, or sorry, non-consumer demand markets. Really to sort of get to learn and understand, because they are counterintuitive systems of, I must build the best and go for the biggest clients and then I will win. In actual fact, it's the complete opposite. Build something that is really good enough, that does one job perfectly well to a market that is screaming out to get that help.
I was going to say, how is it, like you've been commercializing for years, how is just getting access to the data science tools added to Advivo ICP or what you're doing?
Well, it's a game changer for us, Linda. It's as simple as that, because, you know, we used traditional methods of market research, our lived experiences, but as Thomas pointed out, it's human scale, where it's like, oh yeah, I know how to get down to the Gold Coast. But if I had to drive somewhere in Europe, what am I going to do? I'm going to go to Google Maps and I can see everything I need to see there. But what's brilliant about the accessibility that we can now bring these to, you know, mid-tier and you know, startups that are well backed and so on, is that, yeah, instead of sort of taking all our own lived experiences, which is really just a fraction of what we really need to look at now with Market Galaxy and Opportunity Mine and other tools that we have access to, we broaden our sight and then we can actually design market entry strategies that are very, very targeted, increasing that probability of success.
How much faster?
Well, we're actually talking about, you know, traditional methods of maybe months, 48 hours. We have a workshop with the client to determine the market segment we want to explore and all the different segments. And then within 48 hours, we've got Thomas's results through yourself that enable us to start looking and understanding the connectivity, who are the incumbents, who are the competitors, who are potential partners that we could collaborate with that is part of a modularization or a system within a system, looking for those niche opportunities. And that's, yeah, it's a game changer to the way we approach and work with clients.
Yeah, I know Thomas looks at it from a, who can I invest in? Whereas you're looking at it from a, okay, who firstly is out there that's competing so we can find those incumbents, but it might also be, where can we get a channel partner, or maybe there's an acquisition target, much faster way of actually knowing who's out there to do that. Last word, given you're our guest. And you're probably going to reiterate exactly what you said.
You'll know what I'm going to say. Just never have a better product. That's it. That's all you need to know.
That's it. Yeah. Evaluate your own. Yeah. So thank you, Mark, for sharing your experience of Hero. Thomas, thanks for being in Brisbane and spending your holiday time. Kate's out shopping though, so we're going to have to get you back early. And Trevor, thank you too for sharing your experience. So if there are some more questions, this is the time. We've got a few more minutes if you'd like to ask any of the team any specific questions.
Yeah, just one for Thomas again. Thomas, you know, you go through, you pick out these companies. How many of the companies that you pick out where you've inferred the data, does it match the reality they come back to you with? And then how many of those do you actually invest in?
Yeah, I think every time I have yet to find an exception. So when we reach out to a company, if we see they're doing well, I have yet to have the case where they actually weren't. So that's good, knock on wood, that continues. If we've reached out, that means we've already gotten rid of the 11,000 or whatever companies that we didn't want to talk to. I don't know, I think when we reach out, we talk, we do due diligence, probably 70% of those we end up investing in. So, because you already know they're winning, you just want to figure out, is there any reason you shouldn't invest? And do you really want to go on the journey with this team? But so many of the unknowns are already answered. They're winning. So you don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to win. You already know that they are, that the team's executing. You don't have to worry if that's going to happen, you know that it is. So it's a much more focused conversation and has a very high conversion rate. So for me, that's nice because it's just efficient, right? I can very quickly get to the portfolio I want. And yeah, thanks.
I cannot believe you haven't got any more questions.
It's okay.
Yep.
Thomas, I'd just like to know how important ESG metrics are and whether they come into your analysis when selecting potential ventures as well. That's environmental, social governance.
Oh, ESG metrics. So we've mostly focused in the last 3 years in healthcare diagnostics. So, we care about ESG metrics, but we're mostly just trying to see, are there any red flags? Are there any problems? Is the company doing anything that we don't like? And so because it's, again, a diagnostics focused fund, that's more how we've treated it. Although we're having some conversations now about some new funds, really actually focused around ESG, right? And which technologies, can you build a portfolio of companies that bring different technologies to that space? So I think it's an exciting place to focus. But anyway, that's just my answer, though, given we had a slightly different focus, but that's how the two have intersected.
Well, good. Well, I think no? Oh. Well, thank you everybody for taking the time to come out today. We really appreciated having you here. Again, I'd really just love to thank Thomas specifically for making his holiday time available, and Mark as well to sharing your journey around Hero. So that's great. And Trevor, thank you so much for sponsoring today and helping get it organised. I know your team are up there somewhere, so if you actually are in a position like Mark and you've got an idea, please talk to the Advivo ICP guys. They've got Advivo ICP caps on, so you might be able to just knock them on the shoulder and ask them about tell them how good today was, or maybe you've got an idea, etc. And I'd really just love to thank to VMP for your great support of getting this out to a big, much broader team or audience. It is all being recorded as well. We'll make sure that you get the recordings as well after this event once we've been able to edit the front and back end of it. So thanks VMP, Natalie and Ian for their contribution. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much. And if you're looking for a media company to do these live streaming events, I mean, isn't it amazing that innovation and technology can actually help us have these events that go much broader than just who's in the room? It certainly has accelerated everything with COVID being on. So I really thank you for all coming along and being here in person. So thank you very much.